Class, go ahead and take your books and go to page number 488. Page number 488, we are finishing up a section on imperialism, and with the end of class today, we will officially be finished with the chapter 18. We'll be going into chapter 19 tomorrow. You guys need to prepare for the test that will be next Monday on chapter 17 and 18. So make sure you've got those notes studied, because I'm going to hand out the test for chapter 17 and 18 on Monday, and you will be able to work on it. I might try to do this. I might try to post the test on Google Classroom, and you can print it off from there. I'm going to see about doing that. Stay tuned. You'll hear for sure. Okay, you should be on page number 488 now. We will go ahead and get started. So we finished up talking about imperialism in Europe and in Asia. We talked about Japan. We talked about China, imperialism in those against those nations. Now we're going to talk about imperialism in Africa. Now this section is actually a bit shorter. Again, that's just due to the fact that this is supposed to be one big section, but they had to divide it somewhere, and the easiest place to divide it was between the Asia and Africa. That was the easiest place to divide it. So we will have very few slides today. We'll go ahead and get to work. Page number 488. So, as we learned in Chapter 6, Africa was the home of several thriving civilizations before the years of 1500. A profitable trade existed between the African kingdoms on the one hand and the Arabs, Asians, and Europeans on the other. European expansion, however, changed the African people from trading partners to subjects. Imperialism in Africa was a mixture of exploitation, as seen by the slave trade, and humanitarian impulse, as shown by the Christian missions. In either case, African culture could not remain unaffected. So you go out in the world, and the left wants to talk about imperialism in Africa as being completely negative. There were large parts of European imperialism in Africa that was problematic. It made subjects out of them in ways that were very, very negative, and we'll talk about that later on. So absolutely, there was negative consequences for the people of Africa under imperialism. But it was kind of divided up. Some people truly wanted to be down there to help benefit the people of Africa. And one of those people that really wanted to benefit Africa was a guy by the name of David Livingstone. So David Livingstone was a English citizen, and he was a preacher. The story goes that he announced his call to preach, and the first message he preached was preached at a small church in England. And again, never preached before. He just knew God had called him to preach. And so when he stood up and preached, he bombed. He knew it was bad. The pastor knew it was bad. He finished preaching and just stood down off the platform. And the pastor didn't know what to do, so he just dismissed everybody. David Livingstone sat head in hands on the front row, thinking, maybe God hasn't called me to preach. And then he felt a hand on his shoulder, and the hand was the hand of Robert Moffat, who is a veteran missionary. We talked about him previously as being a missionary pioneer in China. Robert Moffat would actually end up becoming David Livingstone's father-in-law. David Livingstone married the Moffat's daughter. But Robert Moffat was sitting in the audience. He knew it was bad. He knew David Livingstone's sermon wasn't very good. But he came up and put his hand on David Livingstone's shoulder, and he wasn't lying when he said this. He said, "Son, you have the potential of being a great missionary for Jesus Christ." That was all the encouragement David Livingstone needed, because he determined that he was called to be a missionary to Africa. And or at least a missionary. I'm not sure if Africa probably wasn't in the cards yet, but he knew God had called him to be a missionary. And over time, he determined that it was God's will for him to go to Africa. and he spent several years as a missionary to Africa, preaching to the tribes in Africa. And then, while he was there doing his missions work, he began to chart and map out Africa. And that opened up Africa in many ways. Africa was known as the Dark Continent. Nobody knew much about Africa. So he was able to provide a lot of information on Africa that the world had not previously known. And he did so well as an explorer that what happened was, after a second or third trip to Africa on missions work, he was approached by the Royal Society for Cartography, if I remember correctly, and they said, "Listen, we want you to go down there and just be an explorer for the crown, and we want you to give us information on Africa." So David Livingstone thought about it, he prayed about it, and he determined that he could still do his missions work. He didn't have to leave missions work completely off, but he determined that it was the Lord's will for him to do a little bit more by way of exploring than that sounds negative, than just being a missionary. Again, he continued to do missions work. While he explored, he began to he was giving out the gospel. The difference was, when he went the first few times, he went under the auspices of a missionary society. You know, there are different missionary societies that fund missionaries today. You have Baptist International Missions Incorporated. You have Macedonia World Baptist Missions. These are missions organizations that provide the funds for missionaries to go overseas. Well, David Livingstone had gone for the first few times as under the auspices of a missionary organization, but now he decides to go not under their funding, but under the funding of the Royal Society for Cartography. So the missionaries are no longer fitting his bill. He's being given money by the crown, basically, to perform his expeditions. But while he's going, he is still going to give the gospel. David Livingstone is one of the greatest missionaries in history. He had a lot of situations while he was in Africa. One of the situations he had was he was out one day and a lion attacked him, and he shot the lion and wounded the lion, but he didn't kill the lion yet. And the lion grabbed onto David Livingstone's arm and crushed his arm and began throwing him like a rag doll. And amazingly enough, I don't know how he didn't lose an arm, but then one of David Livingstone's traveling companions, his translator, his African translator, showed up and shot the lion again, and then the lion turned on the African translator, and then before either one of those individuals died, the lion gave up the ghost. So both David Livingstone and the African translator survived, even though they were both injured by the lion. So David Livingstone had a lot to do in Africa. And when he died, he actually died in Africa, and the Africans knew they had to send David Livingstone's body back to England, but they asked the English government if they could cut out his heart and bury his heart in Africa. And the English government gave them permission. So they cut out his heart, buried his heart in Africa, and then sent the body back. This is an example of, this is part of the good things that happened with imperialism. If it hadn't been for imperialism, the gospel would have not spread to Africa when it did. That being said, of course, there are negative aspects to imperialism in Africa that we'll get into in a few moments. Another one of the interesting things about Livingstone's ministry is, at one point, everybody in England thought that he had died because they hadn't heard from him. None of his letters were getting back. None of his journals were getting back. They had no evidence that he was even alive. So Britain is wondering where he is, and a New York newspaper in America decided it'd be a great publicity stunt if they could find Dr. Livingstone. And so they sent a guy by the name of Henry Stanley to see if they could find him. Enduring great physical hardship, Livingstone journeyed into the African interior. He was devoted to opening up Africa to the gospel, and in the process bringing an end to the slave trade. See, that's another thing. David Livingstone was anti-slavery. His hope was that by opening Africa, he would end up closing the slave trade, because that was one of the other things about imperialism. Imperialism allowed for the slave trade to exist and to really prosper. So he wanted to close off slave trade, and he hoped that opening up Africa would change that. While on one of his lengthy expeditions, he remained away from civilization for so long that people wondered whether he were still alive. Part of a publicity campaign, a New York newspaper hired the British explorer Henry Stanley to find Livingstone. In 1871, Stanley found him at Lake Tanganyika and casually greeted him with the now famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" After this meeting, Livingstone continued to travel and preach, but died in his beloved Africa 2 years later. So Henry Stanley went and successfully found David Livingstone and brought back news to the world that he was still alive. All right, next slide. So what happened next, this is where imperialism really begins to kick in. What happens is there is a conference in Europe. And again, this is after David Livingstone dies. There's a conference in Europe because now Africa has been largely charted out and mapped. And all of these European nations began to stake out claims on these African lands. They began to say, okay, we want some of this, we want some of this, we want some of this. And all of the European nations began to take the maps that had been made of Africa, and they began to say, okay, France, you can have this. Okay, Belgium, you can have this. Okay, England, you can have this. And they began to chart out colonies that these nations could have. And that is, I mean, listen, that's a horrible thing to do. You're giving away land that's not yours to give. I mean, at least if you're going to, and I'm not suggesting it would have been better if they had done this, but if you fight for a nation, if you fight for a colony, and again, I'm not condoning fighting, but I'm saying at least you can say that at least you can say now that there is, you have fought for it. But they basically don't take any care for the people there. They just say, okay, here's land. Well, we'll just go ahead and divide it up between all these nations. That's not a good way to handle things. So they began to divide up these African lands. Britain was interested in the entire continent of Africa in the north. She secured controlling interest in the newly built Suez Canal. To protect this lifeline of British trade with India and the Far East, the British government assumed control of the Egyptian economy and government. In southern Africa, British imperialism was directed by Cecil John Rhodes. He was known as the Empire Builder. As a young man, Rhodes went to the southern Africa and made a fortune in diamonds. He became a firm supporter of British imperialism, working tirelessly to advance British interests as well as his own in Africa. He dreamed of an uninterrupted line of British territory stretching from Egypt to in northern Africa to the Cape Colony in southern Africa. Although his goal from Cape to Cairo was only partially realized, he helped Britain acquire additional territory in Africa, including Rhodesia, which was named after him. So that's what Britain kind of wanted to maintain. Now, while Britain was maintaining some of this land, France said they wanted some land too. So the French came around and they say, listen, we want land too. While Britain acquired African territory in the southern and northeastern parts of the continent, in 1830, France slowly began to build her African empire by sending troops to Algeria. The following year, Louis Philippe established an elite army group that would figure prominently in the history of the French imperialism. The famous Foreign Legion, hold on, let me fix this because I typed this wrong. It is well, it could have been fine with just Foreign Legion. Let me make it French Foreign Legion. Help you remember a little bit better. The French Foreign Legion, that's an elite army group established by Louis Philippe that extended French control over French territory in Africa. Alright, then after England and France, you got Belgium. So Belgium's African possessions consisted of one large mass of land in Central Africa called the Congo. Between 1878 and 1884, King Leopold II of Belgium hired Henry Stanley as well as other explorers to acquire as much of the region as possible. As a result of this activity, Leopold soon personally controlled the 900,000 square mile Congo Free State, a land area over 75 times larger than Belgium. Unlike the British and the French, Leopold's agents severely mistreated the natives. Here's an example of imperialism going awry. The French and the British really treated their colonies pretty decently, but Belgium, oh, they absolutely mistreated them. When news of their atrocities reached Europe, there was such an outcry that the Belgian Parliament forced Leopold II to turn over the administration of the Congo to the Belgian government, which renamed it the Belgian Congo, which is modern Zaire. Let me pull up here a picture of Zaire. Actually, it's not called Zaire anymore. It's called the Congo. Now let me get a picture of the Congo line or something. Okay, here we go. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Well, there was supposed to be a map there. Why is it not pulling up the map? Here we go. Okay, so we've got the Congo right here. It's in the purple. So that's the land that Belgium controlled, and Belgium mistreated such to the extent they had to give it up, or the King Leopold had to give it up and turn over that control to the Belgian government. All right. Now, Germany comes to the forefront. Now, Germany had just become a united state. Germany had been existing as a bunch of smaller states for years, and now they had just become one large nation under Otto von Bismarck, and they wanted to assert their dominance overseas in Africa. So they tried to take control of some area, and Germany sent Dr. Karl Peters to secure her colony in East Africa. And then on page number 492, you are seeing here a division. You're seeing how imperialism in Africa was divided up. Who controlled what? All right. Next, we're kind of moving out of Africa. We're moving into the Balkans. For centuries, the Turks had controlled the Balkans and the Near East. But with the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, European nations began to extend their spheres of influence into this region. The most aggressive nation was Russia. Russian imperialism was different from that of other European nations. Whereas Britain and France, for example, sought territory overseas in Africa and Asia, Russia sought to gain additional territory by simply expanding her borders. One of Russia's major territorial objectives was to control the straits leading from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. And you see a picture right here on page number 493 of what was lost by the Ottoman Empire and gained by the Russians. The Russian expansion in the Balkans threatened to upset the balance of power in Europe. Such concerns that led to the Crimean War in 1854 to 56. In 1877, Russia renewed her efforts to extend her influence to this region by initiating war with the Turks. This war strengthened Russia's position in the Balkans while virtually pushing the Ottomans out of Europe. But once again, the European nations stepped in. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, they forced Russia to back down from some of her gains won from the Turks. Russia continued her expansionistic designs, however. She made a concerted effort to push southward through Afghanistan and Persia towards the Persian Gulf. So now, Russia's wanting to get control of some of the South Asian countries of Afghanistan and Persia. Persia is modern-day Iran. So Russia's pushing south, and Britain is getting concerned. They're concerned that such expansion could imperil their own prized possessions of India and the Suez Canal, which was their lifeline into India and the East. The rivalry between the two was temporarily settled in 1907 by the Anglo-Russian Entente. So, The Anglo-Russian Entente was a treaty signed by Russia, England, and other nations that divided Persia or Iran. It wasn't known as Persia. It wasn't known as Iran back then. It was known as Persia. You see the kind of purple and tealish lines that indicate the Russian sphere, and then the pink and teal sphere that indicates the British control. That's what the Anglo-Russian Entente did. It divided Persia into 3 zones. The British-controlled southern zone, the Russian-controlled northern zone, and then the teal was a neutral zone. No one had control over it, which allowed there to be a buffer between Russia and Britain. They didn't want Russia going south into Britain. They didn't want Britain going up north. They had a buffer zone to make sure that they were disconnected and there wouldn't be any border disputes, because that would have happened and there would have been consequences for that. So we're now at the end of the chapter. Let's look at some of the results of imperialism. Let's look at some of the negative results. The military and industrial might of the European nations enabled the Europeans to exploit the people and wealth in their overseas empires. Occasionally, greedy territorial officials and foreign merchants amassed personal fortunes at the expense of the native populations. Some Europeans even abused the native peoples. When dividing up the African territory, for example, imperial powers often ignored ancient tribal boundaries. This action produced strife as opposing tribes were grouped together or as tribes were split and ruled by different European countries. Similarly, Westerners tended to downgrade native cultures. Many of the Africans and Asians resented having Western culture imposed upon them. And then let's look at some of the positive results. Though much wrong was wrought by imperialism, there's no disagreement that there was negative consequences of imperialism. Much good was accomplished also. The most outstanding benefit to the native populations was the missionary outreach. God used the imperialistic movement to open foreign lands to the gospel. In many territories, missionaries helped to establish a written language for the native people, so that the Bible could be translated for their use. Westerners also built schools, hospitals, and public buildings, and introduced railroads, industry, and modern technology. They did their best to abolish the remnants of the slave trade as well. The concern shown by United States President William McKinley sums up many of the motives for Western imperialism. When the United States acquired control of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War, President McKinley said, quote, When next I realized that the Philistines had dropped into our laps, I confess I did not know what to do with them. I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, and I am not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed God Almighty for light and guidance more than one night. And one night late it came to me, one, that we could not give them back to Spain, that would be cowardly and dishonorable. 2, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be that would be bad business and discreditable. Number 3, that we could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule over their worse than Spain's was. I just want to point out here, he isn't saying they were unfit for self-government due to their race. Many times the left tries to make it sound like, oh well, you say that they're incapable of self-government because their race is horrible, that because you think they're a horrible race. No, that's not what McKinley said. McKinley said they do not have the infrastructure or the common values to self-government. If they had the ability to do it, then he would have given them the freedom to self-government. But his concern was it would be anarchy, and it would be such discontrol that it would be dangerous to leave them by themselves. And number 4, that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace to do the very best we could for them as our fellow men for whom Christ died. Watch that last sentence here. Take and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could for them as our fellow men for whom Christ died. President McKinley realized that these Filipino people were souls just like man, just like the white man. He realized that these people were no different than the white man. God died for them. He died for them as well as us. This was not racism. That is the end of the chapter today. Make sure you're staying close. You're staying close at hand with your assignments. Get ready, because this coming Monday you're going to have a test on chapter 17 and 18. So be sure you study that. I just want you guys to know that I love you, and I'm always praying for you.